Let's see. Hopefully the audio is all right. It's impossible for me to check it. So I'm Clint. I work at a company called NetFoundry. NetFoundry is the sponsor of this project called OpenZiti, which is all about zero trust. And every good open source project requires a mascot. We have a mascot, and that is Ziggy. Also, I'm a sheepdog. I went to the Rochester Security Summit, and when I was there, they had a keynote speaker, and the keynote speaker was from the FBI, and he closed with this sheepdog badge, saying that everybody who cares about security and who is protecting the flock needs a sheepdog badge, and called himself a sheepdog, and said everybody in the audience is basically the sheepdog, protecting the sheeps from the dirty wolves that are out there. So I liked it. I put it into my Rochester Security Summit talk, and it's still there. So that's what the sheepdog's all about. I then asked people in the audience at the Rochester Security Summit who was a software engineer, networking engineer, a security engineer, or other. Far more others than software engineers. This is a talk about application embedded zero trust. So it's unexpected that you're a developer, but probably developers are really the target for OpenZiti. But even though developers are the target for OpenZiti, anybody know what this might be?
Longest road?
Yeah, the longest path that you can walk across the earth. So whether you start in Asia or start in Africa, I don't care, right? But that's the longest path you can walk. And this is your journey to zero trust, because nobody is going to start out going application embedded right out of the gate. You're going to start slowly and make your way forward from there. So I like that slide. It represents that journey that you're on. Love this slide because talk about zero trust. Get an eye roll that's similar to this. Not updating the CPU must be just out of control. But zero trust is quite the buzzword, and depending on who you talk to, it means something different. So thanks everybody for showing up and listening to something about zero trust. Here's our little overview. We're going to talk about current networking security, what you usually look at when you try to secure a network, a little bit about zero trust concepts, how embedding zero trust into your application gives your app superpowers, and then we'll look at a few that we've already done. You can take a look and see what kinds of things there are out there. So let's talk about the current security setup. What do we think about when we talk about networking security? Generally speaking, this is a basic network. You'll have a house, maybe your house, my house, any house. You'll have a home office like this facility here. You'll have cars that are IoT cars, communicating to radio towers, what have you. All of these things need security. So we have this idea of the wall and the moat, or the castle, or whatever your vibe is. And the whole job in life is to keep your data safe and secure once you're in the castle. If you make it over the castle walls or through the drawbridge, over the drawbridge and through the gate, however you get in there, once you're inside the castle, you're considered trusted, and you can talk to everything else that's inside your network. People said, hey, that's a pretty bad idea. About maybe 15 years ago, people started realizing HTTP probably isn't so smart. FTP, probably not the best idea. Let's start using TLS everywhere. So SCP came around, SSH came around, HTTPS came around. All great ideas. So, we're doing secure protocols. We can just go home, right? Everything solves everything. Secure protocols, done, right? Well, the idea of security and having secure protocols was so popular that there was a plugin that used to be called HTTPS Everywhere. Its whole job in life was to do nothing more than notice if you were going to an HTTP website, find the HTTPS and send you there if there was such a thing. That was so popular that all the browsers do this now. If you are trying to go to an HTTP website, it's almost difficult to do nowadays. And then Let's Encrypt. Everybody probably knows Let's Encrypt. It's a certificate authority trying to make it easy and free for people to use these secure protocols. Popular ideas. So why are we worried about secure protocols? Why is that not the end of the conversation? It's all about this idea of horizontal movement. So we have an attacker now behind our castle walls, And attackers are going to do what attackers want to do. They're going to find a target of opportunity, and they're going to compromise that target. So this attacker has moved horizontally in the network, which is usually the goal of an attacker. They'll gain a foothold, and then they'll try to get somewhere else, anywhere else, trying to advance further and further until they find something that's juicy, some nice target. So that's what we call horizontal movement. If you've never used a VPN, which I doubt, everybody probably has used a VPN, this is exactly how VPNs work. Once you are on the VPN, you almost certainly can get to everything on the VPN. I have personally never seen a segmented VPN, but I'm sure that they exist. There are probably multiple VPNs places. So people say, that's a dumb idea. We should segment our network. So now the attacker gets back on the same network, tries to send malicious packets to that same address, but the network doesn't let you even send data there. There's no way to get there from the attacker's machine. We have Ziggy in the cop outfit, patrolling, making sure the packets don't get there. Well, what happens? There inevitably will be a system administrator, a QA engineer, a developer, somebody who will have access to both networks. So the attacker will just do what attackers do. They'll compromise that developer network or that developer laptop, and then move over to wherever their target of opportunity is. This is where zero trust starts coming in. So we're going to go back to our basic network design. This time we're going to introduce the concept of device identity. Device identity is the idea that the network won't even allow you onto the network without presenting some sort of cryptographically verifiable strong identity. So here we have little firewalls. Every single site basically has its own little firewall. Getting that identity to places is difficult. So this is the 9-step process that OpenZD uses. It's a really nice 5-part write-up by one of our Rock Dev members, Andrew Martinez, about how to bootstrap trust. You can read about that, or we can talk about this later if you want. It's relatively complicated, but not impossible. So here we are, we have our attacker. Our attacker has gotten onto our network, and they're going to try to send data to that target of opportunity, but the network won't even let them do that. Every single entry point to the network basically has a little deny all firewall. They don't have that strong identity. But attackers are persistent, so what they're going to do, they're going to find that developer, that QA laptop, and they're going to compromise it. And now it does have the ability to send data to that target machine, compromise the target machine. So we've defeated the device identity, but what we've done is we've made it already so much harder for an attacker. The attacker has to compromise somebody who has that strong identity, which is allowed to get to that machine. So how do we fix this problem? The next pillar of zero trust is called least privilege. So now the overlay network, not the underlay network, but the overlay, the zero trust network, it understands what identities are trying to communicate to which other identities. So when this attacker gets onto this machine and compromises it, sends its data, the network realizes that the machine that's sending the data from is not permitted, and so it doesn't allow the traffic to be sent to the target of opportunity. Great. Except what's going to happen, they're going to find a developer's laptop or a QA laptop or somebody who's allowed to actually get there, and they can compromise the device. But we've already added 2 more hoops for the attacker to jump through. They have to find an identity, and they have to find an identity which is authorized to access the service which they're trying to access. The final zero trust pillar that I like to put in the presentation is continuous authorization. So generally what this means is, am I running the right software? Is the software up to date? Is it patched? Is it the proper operating system? And that sort of thing. So you have a little agent that runs that can check to see if you have the right MAC address or whatnot. All right, that all for one reason, to stop the traffic from even getting onto the network. So it can't even traverse the network. You can't get on there if you don't have the continuous authorization. All right, so now let's talk about application embedded zero trust. Overlay networks, I don't know if everybody knows what that is, but basically you have the internet, which is what I think the overlay should be built upon. And we have this thing we call the ZD overlay network. So it starts with a controller. That controller's job in life is to do things like authorize sessions, create paths for data and whatnot. We have edge routers and regular routers, and these things are important because they'll go and form together. They'll form a mesh network. So in OpenZD, every single router can connect to other routers depending on what you advertise. So you can make a mesh network, And then all those links are going to be mutually TLS authenticated. So a router can't connect to another router without presenting a strong identity, and the connecting router will have to present a strong identity back, otherwise no link will be formed. And those are for one purpose, which is to allow edge devices, these APIs on the right-hand side or clients on the left, to be able to participate in the network for that one reason of sending data between your client application and the API and back and forth. Here's 3 basic levels of zero trust. You have network access, host access, and application access. So network access, what does that mean? Generally speaking, when I think of a network connection, there's always a beginning point and there's an end point. You can think of them as initiator, terminator, or client and server, whatever you want to think of it, whatever that euphemism? No, what's the word? Whatever the idea is, that's in your head. I can't think of the word right now.
Analogy?
Analogy, thank you. That's the word. Jeez, I couldn't come up with that. So usually with network access, zero trust network having access, you think that there's some router somewhere and it is somehow connected to another router through the magical zero trust overlay. And then once your traffic either gets to the router, it's trusted on your local network, it's trusted on your device's host, or on the remote network, it can leave the router and traverse your trusted private networking space. This is like the first step people will go on that zero trust journey, and makes a lot of sense for a lot of people because lots of network time goes into securing your private networking space. Zero trust is really about not trusting even that private networking space, though. So what you can do is you can go one step further with zero trust host access. In order to do zero trust host access, you're going to need some sort of agent that runs on the device. You can see we've already reduced the zone of trust. We no longer trust the local network whatsoever. We are now trusting the device host itself, the applications on the device, and the device's host network. That's important because with an agent like this, any application that's on this machine will be able to access that tunneler. This is a client more like WireGuard would be, or OpenZD, but it's not a VPN. It's a zero trust type of idea. You do not have access to anything because you have to be authorized as well. But it's much smaller trust zone. For lots of people, this is also good enough. Funny enough, I don't know if you follow Istio, but Istio just recently undid their not pod, but pod. What's the thing inside of the pod? Container. Sidecar. That's the word. They undid their sidecar approach and are going with a node-based approach instead. So that because apparently people think setting up Istio is complicated and difficult. Instead of having sidecars and everything in an Envoy proxy, they have the Envoy proxy running at the node, which is much more in between. It's kind of in between host access and network access because you're going to have multiple pods running on one node. But it is somewhere in between, and I actually don't have a slide for that. But Istio used to be more like zero trust host access because in your pod you would have those sidecars. You can go one step farther though, farther, whatever, which is to actually bring that zero trust concept and put it into your application itself. Now you no longer have to trust the host network. Why that's amazing is because now you're immune to side channel attacks. You won't have listening ports in your server applications on the underlay. With no listening port on the underlay, you're not attackable via the underlay. You're only attackable via the overlay. You still have a little tiny bit of trust in here with the device host or the server host or whatever. I actually need to put one more slide in where I demonstrate a hardware root of trust, which is like a YubiKey, if you're familiar with YubiKeys. So if I had a little dongle with a hardware root of trust on there, I wouldn't even have to trust the device host anymore. I had to probably trust the electronics of it, but not everything. I wonder if you could tap into the operating system then. Anyway. So application embedded zero trust, we're going to focus on our attacker and our target. We're going to take an SDK and we're going to bake it into an application. And when we do that, it puts a little lock icon on the application. Now you know it's secure. So then we're going to deliver that secure application to these compromised machines. And so now when this attacker tries to use like a SCP and send SCP data, well, great, they can SCP because the SCP app can talk to the SCP app, the SQL Server app can talk to the SQL Server app, and the FTP app can talk to FTP. Mind you, FTP will come back in a second here, because with application embedded zero trust, if you actually use the zero trust SDK, the protocol itself is no longer as important. End-to-end encryption is a key superpower of any zero trust SDK. So if that SCP app tries to send FTP traffic, it won't be able to, obviously. If it tries, if the SQL Server app tries to send FTP, it can't. Same is true for sending SCP traffic from SQL. You just can't do that when you have application embedded zero trust, and that's where OpenZT comes in. So here's some superpowers of embedding zero trust. On the top, you have the beast, and on the bottom, you have a Mad Max style security. If you're not familiar, the beast is the limousine which the President of the United States rolls around in. The doors are blast proof, the windows are bulletproof, the tires are run flat, there's like explosion protection underneath the undercarriage, but you'd never know it by looking at it. As opposed to the Mad Max style of security, where everything is quite visible. You know where the chinks in the armor are, you know where to target your attack, you know what kind of armor you're looking at. With application embedded zero trust, you kind of have the beast mentality, where an attacker has very little to go on other than the binary itself, maybe looking at whatever traffic comes out of the application, but it'll all be encrypted. Another really killer superpower from my perspective is addressability. When you're using an overlay network from your application, you can do things like, hey, send this traffic from Clint to Prometheus. And so you can name the identity of the service which you want, or the identity of the provider of whatever the service is, and say, I want my traffic to go to Prometheus, as opposed to the old school way of doing things where you would have an IP address. So this is also similar to web ACLs, where if you wanted to allow everybody in this building to SSH to my Amazon machine, I've got to allow everybody on this Wi-Fi access to my machine. So even though it's low likelihood somebody in this building will attack my SSH server, is not an impossibility. And you know, when you're at bigger and bigger venues, football stadiums or whatever, that becomes much more possible. Although I don't know how probable it is. But you also lose things like when you go through a load balancer. If you're really lucky, the network engineers configured the X44 for you, and you can get the source IP address, and you can actually use that source IP address to do whatever interesting thing you wanted to do. Usually it's useful to have it in logs to know, this user connected. But if you're coming from a synthetic IP address like a home office, everybody comes from the same IP address, so it kind of makes a mess. With zero trust baked into your app, it's much nicer. You actually know it's this identity who's actually sending this data, and you know exactly who it's going to. I mentioned servers before. I mentioned not listening on the underlay, but this I think is my favorite superpower of zero trust SDKs. You can actually put it into your server side. Generally speaking, networks, you think of the VPC in Amazon as safe and secure, unassailable. I don't know how many actual attacks there are inside of Amazon, but I imagine it's non-zero. I just never hear about them. But people think about that network as being safe, right? It's really not a best practice to trust it. If you can get away from it by embedding an SDK, I really recommend you do it. In fact, I like it so much I put this slide in here 2 times, because now you have no inbound firewall holes. You have outbound. You need outbound because the SDK will connect to something that is listening on the open internet, those edge routers. But your application does not do that. And then you have no listening ports, so side channel attacks, even from within your own server infrastructure, data center, whatever, private data center, not possible when you're on the overlay. You have to have a strong identity. You have to be able to get to that overlay. So this is relevant because about December of last year, anybody running Java and Log4j probably had a hard summer Christmas because when they were running around patching all of their applications that used Log4j. And what happened, it was a pretty critical vulnerability. Attacker could just attach to an unauthenticated port, listening, running the a job application with Log4j in it and potentially be compromised. Well, if you had no hole in your firewall, your attack vector is reduced substantially to only the people who are on your overlay network. Again, remember, if you are on the overlay, you're still attackable. But you would need a strong identity, and if you had application embedded zero trust as your application, even if your device was compromised, an attacker would have to compromise your application as well and figure out how to poke the application in order to send the malicious payloads, just raising the bar further and further. Spring also had one of these. CVEs, critical vulnerability and exploits. Anything that's over a 9 is like, you should patch this right now. If it's a 10, it's a you should patch this already. Log4Shell was a 10. This one was a 9.8. We actually go and look for CVEs, which are attack vector of network permissions required of none. Lots of those CVEs exist, 0 days, 0 days, whatever you want to call them. And then if we find one, we'll actually tweet about it from the OpenZiggy Twitter handle. So if you're not following OpenZiggy, you should follow OpenZiggy too. I love the fact that because you're on the overlay, you can now address the client from the server without the need for doing crazy things like HTTP long polling, or without implementing WebSockets or server-side rendering or server-side messaging, whatever the other technique is. But you can now directly address clients from the server, which I think is pretty neat. Other nice thing about that is the client has to be addressable. So you have to have specifically had the bind privilege given to whatever service the server is attaching to. The server has to be able to send or dial the service as well. So there's a lot of additional security on top of it. You don't just have to have an authenticated session. You have to actually go through all the zero trust overlay goodness. It's also serverless. So we have a Python SDK. We had an intern this year take the Python SDK, use the Amazon Lambda, scrapes the NIST database of CVEs, and sends me a message, and then Ziggy can tweet about the CVE. End-to-end encryption, I brought this up before, but this is a great superpower of any zero trust overlay and SDK. OpenZD uses ChaCha20 Poly 1305 with libsodium. Those are the Cypher and the Mac, which are specifically targeted toward low-power devices. So if you have IoT device and you want to use the CSDK, libsodium is great for end-to-end encryption. Also does end-to-end encryption on UDP packets, which is not something that everybody does. So when you intercept UDP, we'll encrypt a UDP packet and send it along the way too. I love this one. Port inference is not permitted. If you are an attacker, you can get onto a router, you can just scan and see what kind of traffic is happening on there, whether you're doing FTP or whatever. But with a zero trust overlay, everything is going to look like whatever the synthetic port is that you choose. In this case, oftentimes 443. So when you send all your traffic, it goes through that synthesized port. Doesn't matter if it's FTP, SQL, or SSH. This is why end-to-end encryption is so nice, because if you have end-to-end encryption and if you have it all going over one synthetic channel, it's much more difficult for an attacker to get any kind of information. That's why I actually asked in the RockDev Slack if there are any pen testers who've come across any of this and had to deal with it, because I'm interested if it just makes their life, like, I want to hear if they, I tried that, somebody had a zero trust overlay and it was just dreadful, I couldn't do anything. Like, that's what I'd love to hear. But I'm not a red teamer and we don't have a red team. Continual authorization, there's Ziggy the cop again. OpenZD implements 5 of them, domain checks. So if you're on a Active Directory domain, you can make sure that they're actually authenticated. MAC address checks, operating system process checks. Generally comes down to like virus scanners, and then multi-factor authentication. We have a customer who's in the aerospace world, and they force their users to enter their MFA code like every 2 hours. So it's a pretty constrained environment. Self-healing mesh network, I think, is an important part of any overlay specifically, but maybe not zero trust overlay, but definitely an overlay. That's the superpower. I don't even know if that's application embedded. Maybe that doesn't belong here. It's so easy. Of course, it's so easy to do. Here's some code on the left. I used to give this presentation remotely. This is legible remotely, but not legible remotely, so I make it way bigger now. On the top, you've got what you used to do before. The developer would need to know what the IP address that they were going to listen to. They'd have to coordinate with the ops person. You'd have to know the port that they're going to listen on as well. As opposed to now with the OpenZD, you just listen for the service. My favorite anecdota on this one was I had deployed a application. It was intended to listen on port 443. And yet none of my traffic would make it from port 443 to my application. And it took forever to figure out what was going on. But it turned out some very helpful network administrator decided that it would be really nice to have port 443 inbound and 8443 outbound. So I was listening on the wrong port and none of my traffic would get there. That was really helpful. It took a long time to figure that one out, and I needed an administrator.
This question.
Yeah.
Do you have to somehow configure? Go back one slide. Do you have to somehow configure this ZD SDK to talk to the appropriate controller or router, or how does that work?
Neither of those things. You do have to. So there's one more step in here that's not shown, which is the bootstrapping of the context. So when you go through the enrollment process, there will be a identity which is produced from that process. Inside the identity is the address of the controller. And you provide the identity to the controller. The controller then informs you of your edge routers. So basically, it's not service discovery, but it's similar. Once you're enrolled, you're done. The enrollment process is also a JWT token, which is a signed document that comes from the controller that has it inside of it. What was the signed document?
Sorry, a JOT.
Oh, JWT, JOT, whatever. You like a JOT? We can call it JOT.
I just heard JWT token.
Yeah. Oh, did you? Is that what it was? Nice. I said JWT is the token, I thought, but maybe I said JWT token. It is a one-time use token that contains within it the address of the controller, and then that controller goes into your identity. So it's mostly all dynamic, I'd say.
One last question: that bootstrapping service, is that another service in the ZD project that you can run?
So in order to bootstrap that trust itself, it is the controller that does that work. So you stand the controller up. The controller has an API which allows you to enroll. However, there are numerous mechanisms to enroll. So if you're take the IoT use case. IoT doesn't want to go through the whole process of sending a JOT to a device. So instead, you can do third-party enrollments where you can authorize a certificate authority from a third party, your certificate authority, and then mint certificates and distribute them to your IoT devices. Then when that IoT device shows up, it will be authenticated based on the certificate which is presented. So you don't even have to go through this process if you don't want to. I usually don't talk about it because most people don't follow all that.
If you did that process, you'd have to get the controller address to the client.
That's the one thing. You definitely need that. You need to know where you're going to send the endpoint. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So do you need to bake in, if I'm thinking of say you're shipping some service to a bunch of users and you want them to be able to talk to your backend securely. Do you need to ship some kind of identity in? Do you need to bake it into in the application if you're doing application embedded?
So I would say it would depend. When I talk to people just ad hoc about applications which don't particularly need to be public, my favorite example is Facebook, because most people, I would assert, access Facebook from their phone. If you are building a mobile application, you are the perfect target for a Zero Trust SDK because you're already building an app. Now, when you're delivering a web page, it's a little different because you're not building an app then. But if you're delivering an application, then your login process would encompass the active enrollment. So when you said, hey, here's your email, click the email, that would do whatever dance that you needed to do the dance in order to get the identity into the application context of the mobile phones. On Apple, they have a keychain, and on Android, they have another word for it, I think. There are two different words for it, right? Yeah. But yeah, that enrollment process should encompass all that. Now, with a web page, it's a little different. There's actually something that we're working on that maybe you'll hear me talk about it at some point. We call browser. It's right around the corner. And what browser is an HTTP agent that listens on a website someplace, and its whole job in life is to inject code into your browser for you, which then gives you a zero trust connection to your actual backend. So that's like right around the corner. I can demo that too. I have a web page that allows us to get to Mattermost, which is our chat app. So I can show you that too if you're interested. But that's a install less zero trust, which is nice. The act of authenticating gets you your identity in that one. There's a third-party provider that you need to, like a OAuth type of dance that you go through, and that will then deliver you your JWT, which then gets enrolled, which then gives you your zero trust connection. So there's a way to bootstrap all that without actually having to install anything and without having to bake an SDK app in. But that's where I go to when I ask that question. My second favorite, maybe my most favorite, I don't know, superpower is implicit MFA. So many. So at Rochester Security Conference, the FBI guy was talking about how so many attacks would have been simply prevented if two-factor was simply enabled. It's so much would have been fixed. Like he estimated like 70% of the attacks. With the Zero Trust Overlay Network, you have implicit MFA. If you want to add explicit MFA on top of that, you can, to have basically a third factor of authentication. And then you have your posture checks too, which you can consider authentication or not. That's up to you. But I love this. So when you have a Zero Trust Overlay, you have that strong identity persistent everywhere. Even if you stole my password, you can't get on the network, right? Like that's pretty cool. I'll just blast through all these. So we have a bunch of existing ones. We have this thing we call the test kitchen, which is where we try out various interesting things. So here's some of them: SSH, SCP. So you might think, why SSH? Well, it's the same reason that SSH. If you put an open SSH server with a terrible password on the internet, something like 30 seconds before it gets compromised, it's insane. So all day long, if you look, your SSH server's getting scanned just by malicious people. Thankfully, SSH is very strong, but who knows? That one scary day, you never know. That's why with ZSSH, you don't have to have an open hole in your firewall. I actually really like this too. My favorite anecdata on this one was when I picked my laptop up and I went to the dentist, and I didn't have to. I joined their Wi-Fi, and I was able to add ZSSH into Amazon to the machine I was attaching to. I didn't even realize I had done it, but I ZSSH there. I was like, I didn't have to update the ACL. What's going on? Oh, I forgot I used ZSSH. So that's really cool. Wherever you go, you don't have to go updating ACLs. SCP is the same reason. I like this slide because it shows you that ZSSH looks pretty much the same thing as SSH does. It's got a couple extra pieces of information, which if I remember, and this was a year ago, I don't recall, I think you can put in a config file. I don't remember, but it definitely has defaults. So like if you make your service name ZSSH, you don't have to supply the service name. If you use if you put it in like .zd/ZSSH.json, you don't have to supply the -C flag. But the remote user is the same. The cool thing here is the target identity. Instead of going to a server, 192.168, whatever, you're going to an identity. So we have these things called addressable terminators, which allow you to send data specifically to a single identity, which is really neat. So you can have one service that says bind as the identity, and then only people who can dial that service can actually even attempt to authenticate to it. SCP looks the same, so blah, blah. Mattermost is our chat app, and I talked about scraping the NIST database, but also webhooks. So I consider webhooks serverless. I probably shouldn't, but I mean, like they kind of are, they kind of aren't, right? I don't know. Webhooks, are they serverless? GitHub Actions? What do you think? Maybe,
yeah,
right?
Let's say yes.
Yeah, maybe. It's a solid maybe to a yes. All right.
Yes.
So
I won't disagree with that.
Right. There you go. I won't disagree. I can't give it a thumbs up, but I won't say no. So we have a chat app, Mattermost, and every time I push, the push will show up in my chat app. And so it looks like something like this. So here you can see Ken has made a new pull request, and I approved that pull request. And so we get little Mattermost messages that say, hey, this thing happened. But that Mattermost server is protected by an OpenZD Zero Trust overlay, so we have to be able to send from GitHub Actions or GitLab to the webhook that's on the other side. So that's pretty cool. really neat one are the generified JDBC wrapper.
Or those gentrified, sorry.
Yeah. Well,
Curious,
that's okay because like ZITIFIED gets a lot of shade for the whole ZDFI, ZITIFY things, as opposed to ZITIFY, yeah. So generified JDBC is really neat. We figured out a way to poke the JDBC driver itself from our like wrapped driver, so you don't have to like they're not bespoke JDBC drivers for like Oracle or for Postgres. It's a wrapper that knows how to poke your particular driver. And why that's really neat is every time you want to access the database, you always have to get on the VPN. And so this is DataGrip from JetBrains, which is a SQL Server client. So if you have a JDBC and you have ZDBC, you can just configure your driver whenever you want to access the database. You just fire up DataGrip and you just go. You don't have to get onto the VPN because it's actually application embedded zero trust. And like I said, it's not just for Oracle, it's for Postgres, it's for any database. That was really neat. We have an article, you can read it. kubectl, Helm, these are all kind of the same idea around Kubernetes. Kubernetes API is a high value target. Taking Kubernetes off the open internet, something shockingly few people do, but it's a good idea. So if you have zero trust baked into your Kubernetes cluster, you can take the Kubernetes API off the internet entirely, which is nice. And so now you can access your Kubernetes API through OpenZD. And here you can see you can either use a tunneler like I'm showing on the bottom hand, or you can use a ZITIFIED kubectl, which is what we have in the test kitchen area.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So does this mean that you guys need to, are you guys hosting sort of like a canonical network, the like edge routers and the internal routers and stuff like that? Or if I wanted to use this, would I have to host my own form of that?
What would you prefer? So I'll say it that way because OpenZD is first and foremost open source software. It's meant for you to take it and to run it and deploy it and have fun, do all your fun open source things with it. So generally speaking, open source, yes. Now, NetFoundry Shield can come in, that's me, right? The company that pays my paycheck. We have a 10 endpoints free forever plan, so we will host it for you if you are interested. And then there's the SaaS version, which is how we're supposed to make money, right? Like, if you don't want to run your own network, if you're too big for there are 3 plans. There's like the $10 a month, $10 a user plan if you've got more than 10, and then the enterprise plan where you've got thousands or whatever. So there's a whole SaaS platform. There's a free platform targeting for people like you and me, and then there's the host it all yourself kind of thing. We have a couple good articles. Jeff, also in the Rock Dev Slack, if you want to ping him, shows you how to host OpenZD on Oracle's free tier. And Oracle's free tier is actually free, and they won't actually charge you, right? Like, it's actually free. They'll just turn it off instead of charging you.
Do they ask for your credit card?
I don't think they do. I think it's actually free, and that's why
it's really great.
It really is great because that free tier of NetFoundry is going to get your credit card. So
that's what you. Okay.
It drives me bananas too, but like it's a gate, a barrier of entry, so that people don't just slam stuff out there.
I mean, Oracle is fine with it.
Right.
Good enough for Oracle. I mean,
don't quote me.
I used to work at Oracle. So
don't quote me. I think that's the case. So yeah, you can do it either way, whatever floats your boat.
And can you like, can you just host it on like one machine?
Yeah, garbage. Yeah, I run it on a T2 micro all the time. You know, as long as you're not streaming Netflix all day long, it'll be just fine. If you do that, you will run out of Amazon IOPS very fast. Like you can run out of IOPS. So all my toy stuff always done on a T2 micro. And then if you don't want to do the toy stuff, get the 10 free tier from NetFoundry because you get a terabyte of transfer a month. Something very generous. Helm uses the Kubernetes API, so you can do Helm Z. Prometheus was pretty neat. I actually did this myself, but Prometheus has all these scary little warning, ingress points, Kubernetes API. This is before, if you wanted to have one Prometheus server scrape multiple Prometheus servers, and this is the whole other talk told you I could give. With ZD, you don't have to have any of that stuff on the public internet, and you have a Prometheus server, which is also listening on the overlay. So you can't even get to the Prometheus server. But, and this is a busy slide, on the left, it uses a tunneling application, which is like a bridge idea. On the right, it's purely application embedded zero trust. So much so that if you look at do I have a little laser? Yeah. It doesn't work. Wow, that's fun. That is impressive, right?
Oh, it doesn't work with
It's anti-glare. It's anti-glare and it's really good. But on the right, a point. On the right, you'll see pod 1 and container B. Container B cannot communicate to container A inside of pod 1 with that Prometheus setup. Even if you deployed a sidecar, you can't get there from here. That's really cool. I think so, whatever. Ansible. So Ansible is over SSH. We're trying to basically get a zero trust Ansible kind of thing working. Also working on Chef right now too. Spiffy Inspire, if you haven't heard of Spiffy Inspire, interesting project. Spiffy is a specification, Spire is the implementation. It's like the reference app implementation. It's all about workload attestation, so short-lived workloads that can be attested to and obtain access to your zero trust overlay. And then we have a fella that went through the LD preload trick. If you've never heard of LD preload, it's dangerous and terrible, but also awesome at the same time. Lets us do some cool things like you can add a zero trust application embedded zero trust without actually having to recompile the app. So it's another one of those bridge things that I talk about because, as we talked about at the beginning, this is all a journey. Getting there takes forever. That's why these things called tunneling applications exist. I showed Joe one earlier, the Windows one, but we have them for Linux, we have them for Mac, we have them for both mobile edges. They have one amazing killer superpower, which is private DNS. So Tailscale, which is a WireGuard made easy product, also has this thing that they call Magic DNS, which is really nice. With ZD, you can have, and a tunneler, you can have top-level domains or DNS names that do not exist, right? So McBoatface is not an actual top-level domain, nor is B-sides, or, I always update this for the talk, and I should have said rockdev at the end. Failure. So that's really killer, because you can actually have DNS names that are not routable. They are not the same IP every single time, which makes it very difficult for them to be attacked. And since it's a zero trust overlay, it's authenticated DNS. So if you deny that identity, poof, all that DNS stuff goes away. It's busy. Executive order, so like the White House thinks this is really important. I like highlighting this because it shows up 11 times in this one memo. So zero trust is kind of coming. I don't know if you've heard, but the government's mandating this. Like you will have zero trust as part of your connection. There's a whole specification that we can, there's a whole, in fact, actually, zerotrust.cyber.gov is a brand new website I'd never seen before. I updated these slides a few days ago. Really nice website, zerotrust.cyber.gov. Here's some of the pillars that they talk about in their zero trust maturity model. Device identity, device, which means posture, identity, data, which means data in motion, application workload, attestation we talked about, and then just network and environment. So now you're saying to yourself, this is so great. How do I get OpenZD, right? That's amazing. You can go out to GitHub, openzd.github.io. This is what it looks like now. I'm redesigning the doc page. Here's all our socials. If you're interested, you can follow Ziggy, you can follow ZD, OpenZiggy. You can go to the test kitchen, check out those things. You can follow us on YouTube. I think there's somebody actually watching the stream. I hope there's somebody watching the stream. That'd be cool. I can't check the comments, so if you made any questions, I'll look here in a minute. And as we all know, the only measurement of a GitHub project that's worth its salt is how many stars it has. So I see 5 people in this room. I hope there's at least 5 stars on that repository. So if you would be so kind as to go give it a star. If you haven't, that'd be fantastic. And with that, that is my whole presentation. I hope you've learned something. Woo!
I have a question.
Yeah.
So Do you guys provide any tooling around like observability? Because
That's a great question. That's actually something that we don't do. No, we don't want to play that. We want to see if there's any.
So I mean, if I embed this in my app right now, I have to, as I always say, I describe myself as a systems administrator. Now, as a sysadmin, I have to assume that my developers provided robust, high-quality logging within the app to troubleshoot with, which has always been the case in every organization I work at. The logging is absolutely flawless. So I'm just curious, my classic go-to has been like a packet capture, right? Obviously, that's totally broken now. I can't do that.
Almost impossible.
There's nowhere within this stack that I can probe, right?
Yeah. So there are. It's a really good question, and I'm just going to be honest. I don't think it's as good as it's going to get. So it needs to get better. Generally speaking, network is like water. You just expect it to be there. And when it's not there, everybody has a heart attack, right? It needs to be there. It needs to just work. My experience, and this is, the shill here, generally speaking, once it starts working, it doesn't fail. There are logs in the routers that you can go to read, to see what you did wrong. It is almost, I'm not even going to say almost, like nowadays, ZD has reached the maturity level where my instinct is, I configured this thing wrong, not, oh my God, what bug am I hitting? So observability, though, is an interesting question. Now, if you use the NetFoundry console, which maybe I can pop up on the screen. I don't know if is that sharing the screen? It is sharing the screen. All right, I'm going to log into my free forever tier. Let's see if do I have this on? I'm going to have to share my, what do we got here?
That's the stream.
Yeah, I am sharing a different screen. I'm
Trying to be the one person watching the stream.
It probably is.
Is that we have at least one person watching
There
the
were
stream?
7.
We're like, here's Oh, okay.
There were 7? Fantastic. Let's see. How do I do share my screen. Where the hell's share my whole? Let's do we're going to do the whole enchilada here. There's going to be some reverb going on, I think. Whoop, 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 whoop. All right. DOPA net. So there's all kinds of metrics that you can tie into
Yeah, I suppose I'm more specifically it's the observability at the OpenZ layer is important, but I just mean like at the application layer, right? Like I can tell you how many times I've had to look at a packet capture to debug some actual application layer issue, right? And if that's entirely invisible to me and I don't have any ability to probe, that magical ZD socket that's now open, and I'm curious if there's any tooling that can help with that, or if you're kind of just out of luck.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that a lot of astute people will bring up is, my WAF. Is my WAF now useless? All the fancy firewalls that we have that do all these other things, are they all useless? I have a non-helpful true answer to that, which is it's a journey. You're still going to have underlay traffic. Your WAF is not useless. But as far as attacking your particular application, when you've limited the number of attack vectors to authenticated users, you know exactly who's coming in. Generally speaking, I think the need for it diminishes tremendously. You don't have just random internet traffic hitting your application. So observability is a real hard question. And now, if you're in the app itself and you're trying to debug it, I'm going to take my sysadmin hat, put it on. If I were using TLS, you would need a private key of some flavor in order to decrypt that traffic. So if you are on the server itself and you are using that server's key to decrypt that traffic and thus capture your traffic in TCP1 or whatever, TCP1, then that is going to be lost. There's no way to do that yet. That's actually an interesting feature request, is to be able to key the data into something else.
Exactly what I'm thinking of, like some kind of method that I can probe in between the app and the ZD SDK and get the traffic.
So basically, you kind of probably need a
Wireshark plugin.
Sounds like BPF. We do everything with BPF now, right? At least in Linux. So
BPF is definitely an option, but you basically need a zero trust man in the middle, which sounds ridiculous. But yeah, that's what you kind of need.
You can build that.
Yeah, no, well, so no, that's the other cop-out answer is, hey, it's all SDKs. You can build that, right? Like that is a terrible answer, but it is true.
No, I'm saying you.
Yeah. I'm saying one could build that.
Yeah.
No, you can build that.
Yeah, it's actually probably not as hard as you would expect it to be. You would need to make a proxy that is allowed to accept the traffic and then authorized to basically resend that traffic. So I kind of like the idea. Like it might be a fun project. Like that's a good intern type project.
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking like React events, to be able to replay those. Replay the SQL commands or something that an application made.
I mean, being able to replay the sequence is interesting. That's one of the
debugging.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Sure.
Think about how fun that would be.
I'm thinking.
So this is I got this little demo that I've had up here. What you're looking at on the left is a Docker container running in a private networking space inside of Amazon. On the right, you can see I have curled before, which is cheating, so it's clear. But I have a tunneler set up here with my Clint Amazon, and it has a impossible to read UI. But you can see there's 3 addresses in here: http.zd, 01.zd, and 1234/32. So there's 3 examples. So I can go to http.zd, and you can see on the left, I get a response. So what happened here is the curl command in my Windows subsystem for Linux was intercepted by the local Windows tunneler, sent to an edge router, which is in my AWS environment. I don't know if I can zoom in here. Oop, that's the wrong way. Come on, come back. Oh my God, how big is this going to go? Why is that so slow? Let's do this. So you can see I have a ZD router that runs on this machine, and this machine can SSH to 172.31.50.50, which is that's the private IP space. That's this guy over here. That's where Docker's running. Docker ps-a. It's running. Go away. It's running this app crc check hello world, which returns that Docker whale. So I can also then go to your curl to HTTP 1.2.3.4, get the Docker whale. You can prove that it actually comes up because it actually locks it, which is nice. You can do CIDR ranges. So if you wanted to do ZTNA, you can do ZTNA through CIDR range. CIDR block is a block of IP addresses. You can make it as big or as small as you want. And that's about it.
Is so obviously the software is open source, but do you guys have like a published, what would in traditional networking you call an RFC, but a protocol explanation and an explanation of the packet format and stuff like that?
Yeah, not really. That's another good one.
Special ZD sauce.
Yeah, it's not special. I mean, you can just go RTFC, It's not documented. It might be documented. It might just be hidden, either squirreled away in a Confluence page, or it'll be in a markdown file that I just don't know about, never read. We have a lot of repositories, so and I don't deal with all of them. So it might be in our Fabric repository. I just don't know it. But there's going to be a little tiny payload that sits at the front that says I want to send data to here, and so that the router can get it and route it correctly.
So it's not like Wire or anything like that. It's actually a bespoke.
It is a bespoke protocol.
Yeah.
Yep.
Not GRE.
I don't even know what GRE is.
Generic routing encapsulation.
Oh, right. Now we
so
do.
Everybody makes their protocol says they do GRE somehow
Right,
more
right.
fancy, and they're like, this is our special protocol.
That's right. No, what's the one from
GRE with a different payload?
Right. There's the one in Amazon that does that, I think. That Dariush put a pull request up to implement. Cool. Any other random questions? You good?
I came late. Sorry.
You did. That's all right. Thanks for showing up. You want me to start over? Well, thank everybody for the live stream. I'm going to end the live stream now. See you guys.